The 1859 Pig War. How a single shot almost started a World War. On June 15, 1859, an American farmer named Lyman Cutler looked out across his potato patch on San Juan Island and saw once again a large black pig rooting through his garden. The pig belonged to Charles Griffin, an Irish employee of the Hudson's Bay Company, and this wasn't the first time it had destroyed Cutler's crops. Frustrated and angry, Cutler grabbed his rifle and shot the pig dead. It was a decision that would bring two of the world's most powerful nations, the United States and the British Empire, to the brink of war. Within weeks, American and British military forces would face each other across tense battle lines, with warships, artillery, and hundreds of soldiers ready for combat. The confrontation would drag on for 12 years, involve some of the most prominent military and political figures of the era, and nearly trigger a conflict that could have reshaped North American history. And it all started with one dead pig. This is the story of the Pig War, the strangest, most absurd military standoff in American history, and a reminder that sometimes the most trivial incidents can have world-changing consequences. The fuzzy border. To understand how a pig could nearly start a war, you need to understand the messy state of the U.S.-Canadian border in the Pacific Northwest during the 1850s. The boundary had been poorly defined by the 1846 Oregon Treaty, which ended a previous border dispute between the United States and Great Britain, which then controlled Canadian territories. The treaty specified that the border would run along the 49th parallel, from the Rocky Mountains to the middle of the channel, which separates the continent from Vancouver's island. That sounds clear enough, until you look at a map and realize there are multiple channels threading through the San Juan Islands between the North American mainland and Vancouver Island. Was the border in the Strait of Juan de Fuca to the south, or the Strait of Georgia to the north? The difference was significant. It determined who owned the San Juan Islands, an archipelago of over 400 islands and rocks between what is now Washington State and British Columbia. Both nations claimed the islands. American settlers had been moving in, establishing farms and communities. But the Hudson's Bay Company, essentially an arm of British colonial power in the region, also maintained a presence, running a large sheep operation on San Juan Island under the management of Charles Griffin. The result was a confused situation where American and British subjects lived side by side on contested territory, each group answering to different governments, operating under different laws, and paying taxes to different authorities. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark turned out to be a hungry pig. The fatal shot Lyman Cutler was a Kentucky-born farmer who had moved to San Juan Island seeking opportunity on the frontier. He had staked a claim and planted potatoes, trying to make a living in the uncertain environment of disputed territory. But Charles Griffin's pigs kept breaking into his garden, and despite Cutler's complaints, nothing was done to keep the animals penned. On that June morning, Cutler's patience finally snapped. When he saw the pig destroying his potato plants yet again, he shot it. By some accounts, he killed it with a single shot. Other versions suggest it took several shots, or that the pig was merely wounded and later died. The details vary, but the outcome was the same: one dead British pig. Cutler, reportedly feeling some remorse, went to Griffin and offered to pay compensation. He offered $10. a reasonable sum for a pig in 1859. But Griffin, whether out of genuine outrage or seeing an opportunity to assert British authority, demanded $100, an exorbitant price that Cutler couldn't possibly pay. Griffin took the matter to British authorities. Cutler, fearing arrest by British magistrates whose jurisdiction he didn't recognize, appealed to American authorities for protection. Both sides dug in. What should have been a minor property dispute between neighbors escalated into an international incident. The generals arrive American settlers on San Juan Island, alarmed that one of their own might be arrested and tried under British law, petitioned the U.S. military for protection. The petition reached Brigadier General William S. Harney, commander of the Department of Oregon. Harney was not a man inclined toward diplomatic subtlety. A career military officer with a combative personality and strong opinions about American territorial rights, he saw the San Juan situation as an opportunity to assert U.S. sovereignty. On July 18, 1859, he ordered Captain George Pickett, who would later gain fame, or infamy, at Gettysburg, to occupy San Juan Island with a company of infantry. Pickett landed with 64 men and established camp on the southern end of the island. He raised the American flag and announced that the island was now under U.S. military protection. It was a bold move, essentially a military occupation of disputed territory, and it caught the British completely off guard. The British response came swiftly. Rear Admiral Robert L. Baines, commander of the Royal Navy's Pacific Station, dispatched warships to San Juan Island. Captain Jeffrey Hornby arrived with HMS Tribune, a 31-gun frigate, and was soon reinforced by HMS Satellite and the gunboat Plumper. The British ships anchored in the harbor, their guns trained in the American position. Captain Hornby demanded that Pickett withdraw. Pickett refused, citing his orders from General Harney. The standoff had begun. A powder keg in paradise. Within days, the military buildup escalated dramatically. General Harney, emboldened by Pickett's initial success and apparently hoping to force a confrontation, sent reinforcements. By early August, there were nearly 500 American soldiers on San Juan Island, dug into defensive positions with artillery pieces pointed at the British ships. The British matched the American buildup. Eventually, 5 Royal Navy warships with over 2,000 sailors and Marines faced the American forces. The British ships carried 167 guns between them, overwhelming firepower that could have obliterated the American positions in minutes. The geography of the situation was telling. The Americans held the high ground on shore, with entrenched infantry and artillery. The British controlled the sea approaches with warships that could bombard the American positions at will. Neither side had a decisive advantage, which meant any fighting would be bloody and destructive for both sides. Tension was incredibly high. Soldiers on both sides were keyed up, expecting combat at any moment. Officers shouted orders. Ships cleared for action. Artillery crews stood ready. One miscalculation, one nervous soldier firing without orders, one overzealous officer deciding to take initiative, any of these could have triggered a battle. And what a battle it would have been. This wasn't a minor colonial skirmish. Both the United States and the British Empire were major powers. A shooting war in the Pacific Northwest could have expanded to other fronts. British forces in Canada could have invaded American territory. The U.S. could have attempted to seize British Columbia. The conflict might have drawn in other powers with interests in the Pacific. All because of a dead pig. The voice of reason. Fortunately, not everyone involved was eager for war. Rear Admiral Baines, the senior British naval commander, was a cautious, experienced officer who understood the stakes. When Captain Hornby asked permission to land Marines and forcibly remove the Americans, Baines reportedly replied with words that would become famous in military history. "Tut, tut, no, no, two great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig? No, no." Baines refused to authorize an attack. He recognized that while the British had superior firepower, starting a war over a territorial dispute, especially one triggered by a pig, would be strategically foolish and politically disastrous. The British government, embroiled in other international issues and conscious of the high cost of war, would not thank him for starting an unnecessary conflict. On the American side, cooler heads were also prevailing at the highest levels. When news of the confrontation reached Washington, D.C., President James Buchanan was reportedly appalled. General Winfield Scott, the commanding general of the U.S. Army and one of America's most respected military leaders, was dispatched to the Pacific Northwest to resolve the situation. Scott arrived in October 1859 and immediately began diplomatic negotiations with British authorities. He also reined in General Harney, who had apparently been hoping to provoke conflict. Scott understood, as Baines did, that the stakes were far too high for the issue at hand. The joint occupation solution, the compromise that Scott and British Governor James Douglas negotiated, was elegant in its simplicity. Both nations would occupy San Juan Island simultaneously until a final border settlement could be reached through diplomatic channels. In November 1859, the agreement was formalized. The Americans would maintain a military camp on the southern end of the island. The British would establish a Royal Marine camp on the northern end. Each nation would station no more than 100 soldiers on the island. Both camps would have full authority over their own nationals, but would leave each other alone. It was an unusual arrangement, two opposing military forces occupying the same small island, each flying their own flag, each enforcing their own laws within their own camps, but carefully avoiding confrontation with each other. Yet it worked. The joint military occupation of San Juan Island would last for 12 years, from 1859 to 1871. During that time, American and British soldiers lived as strange neighbors, sometimes socializing and even competing in friendly athletic contests, but always conscious that they represented nations with competing territorial claims. Life during the occupation, the joint occupation, created a peculiar situation on San Juan Island. At the southern end, in what became known as American Camp, U.S. soldiers built barracks, established gardens, and went about the routine business of garrison life. At the northern end, British Royal Marines did the same at their camp, which they called English Camp. Between the two camps lived civilian settlers, Americans, British subjects, and others, who found themselves in the odd position of living in territory claimed by two nations simultaneously. They could theoretically choose which jurisdiction to recognize, which laws to follow, and which authorities to appeal to when disputes arose. Relations between the two military camps were generally cordial, even friendly. Officers from both sides occasionally dined together. Soldiers sometimes competed in shooting contests and boat races. There were even reports of joint celebrations on holidays. The men on the ground, unlike the governments they represented, had no particular desire to fight each other, but the underlying tension never completely disappeared. Both camps maintained strict military discipline and readiness. Sentries stood guard. Weapons were kept clean and ready. Regular drills ensured that if hostilities did break out, both sides would be prepared. The civilian population gradually increased during the occupation. Farmers, merchants, and entrepreneurs saw opportunity in the islands, despite, or perhaps because of, the uncertain political status. By the late 1860s, San Juan Island had a substantial civilian community that dwarfed the military presence, the long road to resolution. While soldiers occupied San Juan Island, diplomats worked to resolve the underlying border dispute. The issue was complicated by other tensions in U.S.-British relations, including lingering American resentment over British support for the Confederacy during the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The Treaty of Washington, signed in 1871, addressed multiple disputes between the United States and Great Britain, including the San Juan border question. The treaty stipulated that the boundary dispute would be submitted to binding arbitration, with German Emperor Wilhelm I serving as arbitrator. Both sides presented their cases. The Americans argued for the Haro Strait as the boundary, which would put the San Juan Islands in American territory. The British argued for the Rosario Strait, which would make the islands British. Extensive documentation, maps, and legal arguments were submitted. On October 21, 1872, Kaiser Wilhelm I issued his decision. The boundary would run through the Haro Strait. The San Juan Islands were American territory. The British accepted the decision with grace, if not enthusiasm. On November 25, 1872, the Royal Marines lowered their flag at English camp, boarded their ships, and departed San Juan Island for the last time. The Pig War was officially over. Not a single shot had been fired in anger. The only casualty of the 12-year military confrontation was the pig that started it all. Why war never came? Looking back, it seems remarkable that the Pig War never escalated into actual warfare. Several factors prevented what could have been a catastrophic conflict. First, senior leadership on both sides, particularly Admiral Baines and General Scott, refused to let local tensions escalate into international war. They understood proportionality and the absurdity of fighting over disputed islands because of a dead pig. Second, both governments had strong incentives to avoid conflict. The United States was on the verge of its civil war, which would consume the nation's attention and resources from 1861 to 1865. Britain was managing a global empire and had no desire for an expensive North American war that would tie down troops and resources needed elsewhere. Third, public opinion in both nations would likely have been skeptical of a war over such a minor issue. Governments need public support for sustained military conflicts, and it would have been difficult to rally citizens to fight over whose pig could root through whose potato patch. Finally, the diplomatic mechanisms existed to resolve the dispute peacefully. Arbitration, negotiation, and compromise were available alternatives to war, and cooler heads chose to use them. Legacy and memory today. San Juan Island National Historical Park preserves both American camp and English camp, maintaining the sites where soldiers once faced each other in this bizarre standoff. Visitors can walk the grounds, see reconstructed buildings, and learn about the only war in history fought over a pig. The park is surprisingly beautiful, rolling hills, rocky beaches, and stunning views of the water and surrounding islands. It's hard to imagine this peaceful place was once the potential flashpoint for an international war. In the town of Friday Harbor, the island's main community, local historians maintain the story of the Pig War as a source of regional identity and tourist interest. The tale has become part of local folklore, a reminder of the island's unique history. The boundary established by Kaiser Wilhelm's arbitration remains the international border today, running through Haro Strait and the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The San Juan Islands are firmly American, part of Washington State, while Vancouver Island and the Canadian Gulf Islands lie on the British, now Canadian side of the line. What we can learn, the Pig War offers several lessons that remain relevant today. First, it demonstrates how seemingly minor incidents can escalate into major international crises when underlying tensions exist. The pig was never really the issue. The real problem was the poorly defined border and competing territorial claims. Second, it shows the importance of proportionality in international relations. Baines and Scott understood that the stakes, a few disputed islands, weren't worth the cost of war between major powers. Their restraint prevented a catastrophe. Third, it illustrates how diplomatic solutions and international arbitration can resolve disputes that might otherwise lead to conflict. The willingness of both nations to submit their dispute to binding arbitration by a neutral party provided a peaceful path forward. Finally, the Pig War reminds us that history is often stranger and more absurd than we imagine. The idea that two great powers would mass military forces and nearly go to war over a pig seems ridiculous, because it was ridiculous. Yet it happened, and only the good judgment of a few key individuals prevented it from becoming a tragedy. Conclusion: the war, that wisdom won the pig. War ended not with a bang, but with a diplomatic handshake and the lowering of a flag. It stands as a curious footnote in the history of both the United States and Britain, a military confrontation that produced no casualties except one unfortunate pig, and a territorial dispute resolved through patience and negotiation rather than violence. Lyman Cutler, whose fateful decision to shoot Charles Griffin's pig triggered the entire affair, lived the rest of his life on San Juan Island. He died in 1890, having outlived the international crisis his rifle shot had nearly created. Charles Griffin, the pig's owner, also remained on the island for years, his loss of one animal having inadvertently shaped the course of nations. The pig itself, the true victim of this story, was never commemorated with a monument or memorial, but in a sense it achieved a strange immortality, remembered as the only creature whose death nearly started a war but ultimately didn't, becoming instead a symbol of the absurdity of conflict and the wisdom of restraint. Today, visitors to San Juan Island can stand where American and British soldiers once faced each other, ready for battle that never came. They can look out over the waters that nearly became a battlefield and reflect on how close the world came to war over a potato-eating pig. It's a peaceful place now, beautiful and quiet, a reminder that sometimes the best wars are the ones never fought.